we have the next seminar series, and we are hosting Paweł Bukowski, who is currently at London School of Economics. But as we heard in the beginning, you are actually now sitting in Warsaw, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so it's our pleasure to have you here. So let me just say a few words about your work. So Paweł, he is a graduate of Central European University. He has a PhD from this university, and his work is mainly related to the economics of education and also the history of economics. And I think you recently also, well, I don't want to say switched, but your recent works are also related to inequalities and social mobility, as is this work that we are going to hear about today. So today, as you see, Paweł will be talking about intergenerational mobility in Hungary. I actually had a chance to see a snapshot of this research, and I think it's very interesting, and the identification strategy is very, very nice. So I'm very much looking forward to hear your talk today and to see the details. So thank you that you are here, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Eva, and thank you to the entire Lab Fam for having this wonderful seminar series. Yeah, I'm from Center for Economic Performance at LSE, and I'm also at Polish Academy of Science, which you can see in my background, at least the wall of Polish Academy of Sciences. So this is a joint work with Gregory, Clark, Attila, Gaspar, and Rita Peto, and in which we are actually looking at the long-run social mobility in Hungary since 1949 until today. And I must mention at the very beginning that this is pretty much still work in progress. This is actually the second time I'm presenting this. I'm not sure where did you see about the snapshot? Maybe it was some kind of very early version like a few years ago. So this research has evolved through time. So this is the most kind of like current iteration. But so I will also appreciate all your feedback and all your comments on this research. It will be very valuable to me since we will be working on this intensively for the next couple of months. So let me first motivate why actually looking at social mobility in the long run and in such a country as Hungary may be interesting to you. So what we know is that at least in the Western world, we observe growing income inequalities, stagnating real wages, and the falling labor share, which of course means that when we think about the lower class, these people have less and less economic opportunities. And this is coupled with relatively low and falling rates of intergenerational social mobility, meaning that people who are poor today should expect that their kids will remain poor in the future, which of course creates a lot of social tension. What's worse, the current epidemic has made things even worse. It has disproportionately affected people from the bottom part of the income distribution. In addition, kids coming from those families have been more badly hit by the COVID in terms of their education, in terms of their learning, and so on, which means that we should in the future expect that social mobility will be lower, or at least it's, or maybe even now. So because of that, we can hear more and more calls for kind of rethinking the capitalistic system in which we live today. So for instance, in the recent book, Thomas Piketty said that to properly address those social challenges and also environmental challenges of our times, we need to go beyond capitalism and the sacralization of private property, right? So he literally challenges the idea of private property here. In another recent book, Branko Milanovic says that how capitalism will evolve depends on whether liberal meritocratic capitalism in which we are currently operating will be able to move toward a more advanced stage, which he calls people's capitalism, where among other things, intergenerational income mobility would be greater. However, the sad truth is that actually we know very little about how these big institutional changes, like move from one system to another one, actually influence social mobility. And this is the main aim of this project, in which we estimate the group level social mobility in Hungary from 1949 until today, in order to shed light on this question, how does the big social change in terms of institutions actually matter for social mobility? And looking at Hungary in this time period is quite convenient, because we have pretty much well-defined country. There was no border changes, pretty much stable population. However, we have two extremely different institutional regimes. We have communism, which lasted from 1948 until 1989, which was then followed by market-based capitalism. And so, you know, by looking at this relatively stable environment, but two completely different institutions, we can kind of try to see whether we find any difference in terms of social mobility. And I must mention that this is a part of a bigger project where we also look at social mobility going back to the late 18th century, so also incorporating two world wars, interwar period, and 19th century. So let me first say a few words about this group level social mobility. So as you may know, the most common approach in the literature was to estimate something which is called individual level mobility. So we simply regress individual outcome on parental outcome. Say we look at association between, let's say, daughter's income and income of her mother. But for that, we need to have relatively good quality survey data where we observe well-defined outcome for both kids and both parents. And because of that, the existing evidence about some kind of long-run evolution of social mobility is limited to only a few recent decades and only a few developed capitalistic economies, where nothing actually interesting has happened in the last few decades. We have just one system. So alternative is to look at something which is called group level mobility. And this was developed by Greg in his book in 2014, where we're kind of looking at the fate of entire social groups. We're not looking at individuals, but we're looking at entire social groups, for instance, nobility, or for instance, Romani minority. And we estimate this mobility of the groups using patterns of overrepresentation of those groups in elite occupations, for instance, medical doctors. Now, the advantage of this approach, which I'm going to talk about this later in detail, how we do this, is that the data is less demanding, and actually we can estimate this for centuries and across many different countries. However, still, this is a relatively young kind of field in this literature, and the existing studies have focused mostly on the Western countries like UK, Sweden, or Scandinavia, or Italy and Finland, with some exception of China. Now, I would like to stress here that these two concepts of individual and group level mobility are very related and kind of complementary approaches, but they're also different. So think about, let's say, a noble family. So the outcome of parents may be, or like income or wealth of parents, may be only relatively weakly correlated with the wealth and income of kids, because let's say the parents may be very fortunate, but the kids may simply waste the entire fortune because they were unlucky or they were kind of extravagant. So there may be some connection between these two outcomes, but because of a lot of idiosyncratic shocks, the connection may be not so strong. However, when we think about mobility per se as a group, we may still expect that this group will maintain its social advantage over the centuries, right? So there may be a lot of movement within those groups, let's say within nobility. Parents may not be as successful as, kids may not be as successful as parents, but we should still kind of, when we think about the group itself, about nobility, we may have different social processes affecting the standing of the entire group. However, still, what I argue are these two approaches kind of capture the same phenomena. So let's say we have a society which goes into more egalitarian direction, which fights its inequalities. Then we should expect that both individual level mobility should increase, but also this kind of mobility of the entire groups. So we should say, at some point observe certain convergence of the groups, and vice versa. If the society which is kind of moving into more in egalitarian direction, we should observe these two measures kind of also pointing into the same direction. Now, so what we found in the study, I think there are just four main findings. So first of all, if we calculate social mobility at the group level for the entire period, so since 1949 until today, we're going to find relatively small estimates, meaning that the social mobility rates are low, which also implies that the correlation between generations is high, right? So here when I'm talking about low social mobility, and what I mean is high correlation between different generations. And this is true if we either look at the advantaged groups such as nobility, but also at groups which are kind of were traditionally disadvantaged, let's say Romani minority. Now, what I think was probably the main finding here is we don't find systematic differences in social mobility between communism and capitalism. Now, another interesting finding is that if you look at Romani minority, which in Hungary is quite populous minority, they were disadvantaged at the beginning of communism, and they even diverged more from the kind of societal mean through time. So this advantage has increased through time. On the other hand, if we look at descendants of the 18th century nobility, those people were still actually very privileged in 1949, and they still remain privileged today in Hungary, although to a much lesser extent. Okay, so, and having this in mind, this study, I think, contributes, or at least it's related to 4 different streams of literature. So first of all, we are related to general literature on social mobility. And here I must mention that, usually if you look at those studies, you find correlation between the outcome of kids and parents to be around 0.2, 0.3, let's say, in terms of income. Now, what we found is something much higher correlation implying lower social mobility. We found it around 0.6, 0.8. And this is not just kind of the outcome of our study, but also the outcome of other studies looking at the group level social mobility, which actually suggests that in general, when we look at groups, social mobility is much smaller than if you look at individuals. The other interesting thing is that actually, if you compared our findings of actually not big difference in social mobility between communism and capitalism, I think it's interesting contrast with the existing studies on long-run inequality in Central Eastern Europe, to which I also contributed. So if, let's say, we look at Hungary at top income shares from the work of Dimitri Mavridis and Palma Mosberger, but we see that actually top income shares, they react a lot to the institutional changes. So they fall dramatically after the introduction of communism. They remain stable throughout the decades of communism, and then they kind of bounce back to a much higher level after the transition in 1989. Now, we don't see the same thing at all when it comes to social mobility, which I think is particularly interesting because, then it may shed some light on this kind of great Gatsby curve connecting social mobility with income inequality. Finally, our studies, of course, related to other studies on social mobility in Hungary. Here, we are the only one actually looking at this kind of long-run patterns in social mobility. However, our estimates are roughly comparable if you look at this different studies which are looking at particular points of time. So there's Andorka paper from the 70s looking at communism, and we kind of compare our studies to them, and we kind of see similar things happening. That was very reassuring. And I forgot to mention just one thing. So this paper is mostly documenting empirical patterns. We're not explaining the mechanisms yet, although we are planning to do so, right? So we're not going to get an answer why something like this has happened, but I'm going to show you just what happened, okay? Just to kind of maybe set your expectations. Okay, so let me now say just very briefly about the history of Hungary since 1948. After that, I'm going to discuss more methodologically how we estimate social mobility, then how we conceptualize this and bring it to the data. I'm going to show you results and some robustness checks. So 1948, Hungary has, same as Poland, has introduced centrally planned socialistic economy. The first few decades were characterized by quite rapid industrialization and economic growth, quite significant social progress. So, the communists were, whatever we think about them, they actually really improved living conditions in previously backward areas. They kind of removed these old feudal institutions taking place. They brought education, they brought kind of empowerment of movement into these areas. We should not forget about this. And in particular, they also, communists targeted these old elites. They targeted, this nobility from the 19th century. They also targeted those like elites coming from the interwar period. Eventually, of course, communist system kind of, because of many reasons, kind of reached a level where it was no longer able to maintain economic growth. It happened at the end of the 70s and the 80s, which of course eventually led to its collapse. After that, we have the introduction of capitalism in 1989, liberal democracy, at least until 2010 when Viktor Orban was elected. And we have a capitalistic economy with kind of which is based on markets. Okay, so that was very quick. So let me now move to probably more interesting part, which is how do we estimate social mobility at the group level? And sorry, and I forgot also to mention, like, in case you have any questions, just please interrupt me. That I think is better than just waiting for the if you are okay with this, Eva, I think that may be nicer. So yeah, please interrupt me in case you have any clarifications or questions. So again, the methodology follows a seminal work by Greg from 2014, The Sun Also Rises. And here, suppose we are looking at some latent social status of some individual I, who is a member of some social group G, and this person comes from some generation T. So let's say we're looking at someone who is a member of nobility, okay? So her status will be a function of the kind of status which she gets just from the fact that she belongs to a certain social group. So this kind of group level component of her status. So she gets something only because she belongs to nobility in terms of her status, okay? But in addition, of course, each of us have some kind of idiosyncratic characteristics and luck, effort, fate, whatever. And this is captured by this kind of disturbance here, UITG, all right? So what is this group component XTG? So we assume that it's imperfectly transmitted across generations. So the fact that I get some advantage because I belong to nobility is, of course, related to the fact that my parents also get some advantage status because they also were part of nobility. However, my advantage from being a part of nobility may be different from the advantage my parents got, all right? So maybe my parents belong to nobility and they had much higher status coming from this simple fact compared to me. So what we say is that this group level component at time t is a function of the group level component at time t for the generation, for the previous generation, so the generation t minus 1. Sorry, when I'm talking about t, I'm talking about generations. And we just simply say that this is beta times the previous generation group level component. So when beta is smaller than 1, it means that the social group is losing its advantage status. When beta is larger than 1, it means that the group is gaining some kind of advantage compared to the society. Of course, remember that this XTG may be also negative. So let's say when you think about coming from the advantage group, this XTG may actually be negative. So you get a penalty because you are born in a certain social group. But of course, as long as beta is smaller than 1, this advantage should kind of decrease through generations. And then of course we can kind of, if we just set up some baseline level of social status given to some social group, it's simply this status times the beta to the power of number of generations which have passed. So our goal is to estimate this beta, which captures rate at which certain group loses its group advantage or disadvantage. Now, how do we do that? So first, we're gonna try to estimate this XTG for each and every generation of social group in order to recover the parameter beta. Now, how do we estimate this XTG? For this purpose, we'll use data from people who work in certain elite occupations. Now, how do we do that? So suppose that an individual gets into an elite occupation, let's say doctors, if her status is above certain threshold or floor, whatever you call it, okay? And this threshold is common for all groups. So it doesn't matter whether you're nobility or Romani minority, if your status is above this threshold, you become a doctor, all right? That's kind of the assumption here. Now, second thing which you have to assume, which maybe we'll clarify why later, is that this individual level of disturbance is normally distributed with some variance, which is group specific, but it's constant across generations. So in other words, all this individual lag you get in your life the distribution of this like depends on to which group we belong, but it's constant for generation, so the variance doesn't change. Okay, so now let's look at the probability that some member of some group, let's say nobility, becomes a doctor, so becomes gets into this elite occupation. Let's simply call it like that. It will happen if her, again, status is above the threshold, which you can, using this this equation, which you can simply write that the disturbance term is below the gap between the group level component and the threshold. Now, by the assumption of normality here, it's simply 1 minus the CDF of this guy here, which you can simply rewrite and can kind of inverse this stuff. So we get that this kind of standardized gap between the threshold and the group level component is simply an inverse of the CDF of 1 minus probability that a group member, the member of the group G, belongs to this elite occupation. Now, of course, this is true for the particular group, but it's also true for the entire population. So if we just ask the question, what's the probability that someone from society becomes a doctor, we can use exactly the same formula. Here, what we can do simply is to assume that when we look at the entire population, there's of course no group level component anymore because we're looking at everyone. So it's simply for the sake of simplicity, but does not really affect the generalizability of this methodology. We can assume that for population, like the xt is 0. So you basically normalize, when we think about society, we simply say that then the xt is 0. Now, when we look at certain groups, this xt may be different, maybe either positive or negative. And since we do that, we simply get this formula. Now, what we're going to do next is compare probability that someone from a certain group becomes a doctor versus someone random from population becomes a doctor. So what we're going to take, we're going to subtract this guy from this guy. Okay? It's very simple math. What we're going to get is that this is a function of the advantage of a given group and this residual component. Now, the next step and next assumption we're going to make is that the variance of the status for the group we are looking at is the same as the entire population. Or in other words, each and every group has the same sigma, which I can, in the robustness check, we actually relax this assumption, and we show that it doesn't really matter much for the estimate. But the advantage there, just for the explanation here, it's nice because then this thing cancels. So what we get is that simply the difference in probabilities that someone random from population gets into elite occupation versus someone from a particular group gets into elite occupation is simply a function of the advantage of this given status of this group in a society. So now, why I'm doing this? Because of course this is kind of maybe enigmatic now. The great thing is that this is observable. So this is what we can calculate from the data. These are simply the inverse CDFs of probabilities of someone random from population becomes a doctor versus someone from a particular group becomes a doctor. So this is what we can observe, and based on that, we can actually back out the estimates of this group level component for certain social group. Now, let me just illustrate just how this kind of maybe intuition behind this methodology. So let's say we have some social status, and we have some simply distribution of the social status, and we're looking at some population or some other reference distribution. Let's say this is the blue line is the population. So this is what we observe, the distribution of social status in population. Now the red line is the distribution of social status in some group of interest, let's say nobility, right? So we see that nobility is more advantage, so that the distribution is shifted to the right. Now assume that, as I said, that social status, when you get status above this threshold or cutoff, as I call it here, you become a doctor. So by looking at probability that someone from nobility becomes a doctor, which basically is the area here, the red area underneath the distribution, and compare to the same kind of probability for a general population or some other reference group, which is the blue line here, we can simply back out this difference in terms of social status between these two groups. So here we simply assume that population, the X rep is 0 because we get population, but you can also kind of compare the difference with any other groups you want. But you see what's crucial here is the assumption that these two groups have the same distribution and they have same variance. But again, in robustness, we can kind of show that, you know, even if you relax this, you can estimate the bias and the effects are not so important. Okay, so now let's say we estimate this XTG. How do we get this beta, which is our goal? So recall this relationship. Simply let's take the logarithm of this thing which we observe. So this difference in probabilities will be the logarithm of XTG over sigma, which can be written as XTG beta T XG0. Let's just expand this. So what we see is that this is something which is observable, is a function of these two things which are simply constant. These are things which do not depend on time, on generations. Then we have a time trend times the logarithm of beta, and then some kind of residual component, which is basically like saying that if we regress this guy on the left-hand side on a constant term time trend, what we're going to get is this coefficient gamma, which is basically the logarithm of beta. So from the estimates of gamma, we can actually get our estimates of beta. And again, if beta is less than 1, it means that this group is losing advantage over time. If beta is more than 1, it means that the group advantage is increasing over time. And you can also reverse this. We can think about this advantage. If beta is less than 1, it means that the group is losing this advantage, so it converges to the mean. When beta is above 1, it means that the group is kind of getting more and more disadvantage through time, so it's diverging from the mean. Now, so what is this guy? P elite is basically the share of doctors in general population, which is basically the probability that someone random from population becomes a doctor. What is PG elite here is simply the share of doctors or some other elite occupation among this particular social group, let's say nobility. Okay, so what do we need here to estimate beta is 3 types of information. We need to know kind of general population. So we need to know this, like people in society. We also need to know who are the doctors. So we need to know the population of doctors. And the third thing, we need to kind of figure out how we define certain social groups. So how do we find in population, how do we find in among doctors, let's say nobility. So let me say how we actually do that in this project. Is it more or less clear what I'm doing? Okay, so let me move on. So I will start with how do we actually conceptualize social groups? So how do we find social groups in the study? So first of all, when I'm talking about the social group, I'm going to talk about the group of people defined by their surnames. So this will be kind of operational, what I mean by social group in the study. Now we have 2 advantage or privilege groups here. So first are people with surnames ending in Y, which in Hungary are suggestive of noble origin. So if you have ever been to Budapest, you maybe ended up on Andrássy utca, which is the main boulevard in Budapest, or you maybe read Esterházy's books, which is also a book about nobility in Hungary. And what's common for these 2 surnames that they both ending with Y. There's some exception here, which we kind of the consonants which kind of exclude from here. So the story here was that, and I think this is somehow also similar in Poland when you think, let's say, about surnames like Wielowiejski or Wielowiejski. So this Y ending has archaic origin. This is how you would make adjectives, like in say in the 16th or 15th centuries. Now, at some points, the grammatic of Hungary was reformed, and so what the idea was to replace this Y with simply short I ending. So instead of having, let's say, Esterházy, you would have Esterházy. Now, of course, the nobility was opposing this, saying that this is, you know, they don't want to change their surname, this is the proud. So they were kind of constantly keeping this archaic Y ending. Moreover, they also enforced the rules already in the 19th century, which would forbid them to adopt such kind of names. So it's still on in Hungary. So in Hungary, you cannot right now change the surname to a surname which would have this noble archaic ending Y. So this is the first way how we're going to define our privilege group, which is basically nobility, by looking at people whose surnames end with Y. Now, the other method is we're going to use the data on the population of high school graduates from the interwar period. And at that time, finishing a high school was a super elite thing. So it was around like a few percent of society actually have finished high schools. So we're going to look at, we have the names of people who finished high schools in interwar period. And so we're going to select surnames which are the most overrepresented among high school graduates in the interwar period. So we're going to find surnames which are much more likely to be found among the high school graduates than in the general society, right? So this means that these surnames have certain high status because they are overrepresented among high school graduates. So these are two ways how we're going to define privileged groups. Now, how are we going to define disadvantaged groups? Here we have three approaches. First, we just simply look at the 20 most common surnames in Hungary in the 20th century, like the most typical Hungarian surnames, basically. They are held by around a quarter of the population. And we show in the paper that they are heavily underrepresented among educational and occupational elites before 1945. So that's one way. The second way, we use the same idea as before. We look at high school graduates in the interwar period, and we find the most underrepresented surnames. So surnames which are relatively popular in Hungary in population, but they were extremely rare among high school graduates, which means that they had very low status associated with them. And finally, using a surname encyclopedia, we're going to look at surnames which have been traditionally associated with Romani minority in Hungary. It's not easy task because Romani people in Hungary also have normal Hungarian surnames, but still this is the only way we can find to do that. In addition, we also look at surnames with fast growing population shares after 1990. The reason is that Romani are the most, it's ethnic group it's a group in Hungary with the highest fertility rate. So actually the population share has increased a lot since the 1990s. So we also kind of try to identify Romani names with this approach by looking at the surnames which have the fastest growing population share after the transition. All right, so this is first I told you how we're going to define our social groups using basically different types of surnames. Now, where do we get the data? So again, what we need is to have some kind of the list of surnames in general population and the list of surnames among the doctors. So when it comes to the doctors, which is our measure of elite occupation, later I'm still going to bring some other occupation, in particular PhD engineering. So for medical doctors, we just basically scanned and digitalized yearbooks of all the medical school graduates in Hungary since the end of 18th century up until today. I'm not going to talk about 18th and 19th and early 20th century. I'm just going to focus on the period after 1949. But we have the data coming back to this earlier times. When it comes to general population, here we use civil registers of marriages, which is available for the first half of the 20th century. And for the period after 1990, we have actually population registries from the Hungarian Statistical Office, where we simply get a surname and we know how many people have this surname in society. Unfortunately, we don't have data for 70s and 60s and 80s. So we simply interpolate between these two data points. Okay, so just some descriptives. If you look at population shares of these 5 different social groups, this is what we get. So when we look at these Y surnames, these are the noble surnames. They are kind of, these surnames are held by around 2% of the Hungarian society. And when we look at those, the most overrepresented surnames among high school graduates in the interwar period, around 0.5% of society. Now, of course, the most common surnames are a much bigger group. Here we're talking about a quarter of population. Then the most underrepresented surnames among high schools graduates are just around 7%. And then the Romani surnames are around 1-2%. This is a great underestimation of the Romani population in Hungary, which is around, it was 3% in the 1940s, now it's 8%. But still, so that's why we cannot capture the entire Romani population, but I think we captured relatively a big portion of this. Now, when it comes to just basic results here, is we look at relative representation of these different groups among doctors. So let's say this number here, 4.5, means that people with Y ending surnames are 4 times more likely to be found among doctors than in general population, meaning that this group is was heavily overrepresented among doctors in the 1940s. And then we see that this has kind of gradually declined. But even today, these people are nearly 3 times more likely to be among doctors than in general population, right? And here, just to kind of stress this again, we are looking at people whose names are simply ending with Y, right? There's nothing more we do to pre-select the sample. Then we look at those surnames, which are very kind of overrepresented in the interwar period among high school graduates. Then we find similar pattern of around 0.45 in the 1940s, which then goes down to 2, and the decline is more rapid. Then we look at this disadvantaged groups, and here the first 2 groups are around the same as 0.7, means that you're much more likely to find those surnames in the general population compared to doctors. So they are underrepresented. And then the Romanis were actually not, they were actually quite close to the relative representation of 1, which means that there's no advantage in the 1940s, but it then kind of declined fastly to 0.3, which is a really strong decline. Okay, so this was just descriptives. Let me now kind of translate this thing into our coefficient, the estimate of beta. And so do you have any questions at this stage?
I actually would have, I don't know, maybe very naive. So you say you work with these names, which is very interesting. I've never seen something like this, but I'm wondering, because people can actually educate themselves, but women can also marry and change the name because of that, which is also kind of mobility. Do you somehow distinguish between these two? Or you just look at men?
Yeah, so here, I should probably have mentioned this. So we are looking here at people who are graduating from medical schools, so people who are kind of age 24, 25. You're right that some of them may already be married. And then in this case, the problem could be that, let's say, someone who is coming from the lower background can marry someone from nobility than to adopt this surname, right? Which would kind of mean that, so this was usually what happened, right? So usually what happened was that a woman from the lower background would marry a man from the higher background. The other way around was less common. So if you have this process, it would mean that we actually may be underestimating the advantage of, let's say, nobility surnames, because then we kind of, we attribute the nobility to women which actually were not noble by origin, I would say. Now, so this is one comment. So if anything, we're kind of underestimating the advantage of those groups. Now, the other comment, actually, I think we have, to be honest, I don't remember right now, but I think we actually have information with the maiden names. So for women, we actually, if we know that there's, so we either we see like this surname which is having 2 components, and then we simply take the maiden name, or we actually have a maiden name. And to be honest, I don't remember at this moment. But we are trying to deal with this. Of course, this still a bit problematic for us, I would say. So this is something which we're working on to try to maybe get a better way of accounting for this kind of selective marriages. And in particular, when it changes in time, it may create certain bias. So this is, so right now we have kind of like a raw adjustment for that, but this is something I would say, this is a very good question, by the way. It's like something which we're working on to improve it. But again, I don't think it would significantly change the picture here. I think it's anything that we would probably just like gonna just shift those lines up and down, but it would not maybe change the slope.
Yeah, but I also can imagine these marriages are not so common, so that it distorts completely your picture. It may have changed.
And actually in the paper, we also argue that still among those groups, there were a lot of this, I forgot the word, to be honest, like people are usually married within those groups. So even if someone adopts a surname, then usually it's still a person from the same social group, especially when it comes to this extreme parts like nobility or, let's say, Romani population. All right, but
I also have a question.
Yeah.
I mean, the choice of the doctor's occupation seemed to be a bit arbitrary, no? I mean, and especially like I guess the social status of doctors would change over time, even a lot maybe. Like I think nobility in the 19th, especially if you would go back to the 18th century, I mean, it wouldn't be super common or super like a favorite choice of nobility for their children to become a doctor, right? I mean, they would choose different. I mean, they would not work at all because they were capitalists, and then maybe they would choose some other occupations like. Yeah, modern medicine starts like after World War I. So
yeah.
For your period, that's not a big issue, I guess. I mean, it also can. Yeah, but so yeah, that's.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent comment. So yeah, you're absolutely right. If you look at 19th century, if you think about, let's say, someone who was just like curing people in the villages, maybe let's say he was maybe like more like bourgeois, like urban elite, but it definitely wasn't a landed gentry or something like that. As you said, I think it's not a big issue after 1949, where I think doctors are still a relatively elite occupation. And actually, you could already see that, those noble surnames are heavily overrepresented among doctors, which I think is already indicative that there's something kind of happening here. In this kind of bigger project, what we actually do for the earlier period, we're looking at the high school graduates and army officers, which we believe it's a better better measure of elites, kind of elite occupation of doctors. In this period, we decided to use it for doctors. We decided to go for doctors. Now, the big problem here, obviously, I would like to have more different occupations, and I'm going to show you in a second results for a PhD in engineering. The big problem here is that because of anonymity reasons, you actually don't get that many kind of records of who are like based on occupations right now. So we're trying to get the registers of lawyers, and we couldn't get that. And I guess because they are more aware about the protecting their data protection issues and so on. So we couldn't get their surnames. We did try to get the names of communist elites, like the party members or like the members of the parliament. The problem with them is that there's actually there were not that many of them. So you end up with relatively very small sample of people from a certain elite occupation, which means that there's a lot of the randomness there. So someone may just like jump in a particular surname. So if you think about parliament, you have observed 50 surnames per every 5 years, basically. When you think about doctors, you observe like several thousands of people every year. So you essentially get much better estimates if you look at occupations like doctors compared to communist parties. Although I must say, we just got revised, we submit for this paper, and one of the big things we are asked is to actually look at different occupations. So we will actually maybe try again to get the lawyers here, which I think probably would be the best occupation. Okay, so let me. Okay, I still have 15 minutes. Okay, that should be fine. So so this is basically, let me just explain you this graph. So here I'm showing you estimates of this group level advantage, this XTG, what I was showing before, that I was defining before. Now here we have like, this is like average to decades. So 1955 here means the period from 1950 until 1959. So this is for the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. So when this number is positive, it means that certain group has a relative advantage compared to the entire population. So the value of 0 means that some group is basically not advantage or disadvantage compared to the population in general. When this is positive, it means that certain group gets some advantage. Members of certain group get certain advantage compared to the rest of the population. Okay, so basically what we have here is that the plotted this group level components, and then we simply draw the linear fit, and so the slope of this can be transformed into the estimate of beta, just the estimate of the intergenerational correlation of status, which in this case is 0.8. So there are few things to notice here. So first of all, we are talking about this Y ending surnames now, so nobility surnames. They were very advantaged during the first decades of the communist rule, right? And we're talking about the regime which was openly hostile towards those people, right? Toward land or elite. We see that they actually were pretty advantaged in the 50s and 60s. At least when we look at medical doctors. Today, they're still advantaged. So the advantage is positive. However, it's much smaller than it used to be in the 50s. So there's actually some evidence for the gradual decline of their status. through the decades. However, you actually don't see like any, you don't see actually that communism was anyhow more efficient at reducing their advantage compared to the capitalism, right? So I'm going to test it later in the next stages. Just to kind of more accuracy continuity evidence. But here you can see there's actually not much like happening when you look at this graph around this kind of, you know, transition to capitalism. Then if you look at those who were overrepresented among high school graduates in the interwar period, you see the same thing, basically relatively high status at the beginning of communism, decline of the status throughout the centuries, but you don't see much changing actually if you compare these two big regimes. Actually, you see that there's even like these groups are even like gaining status in the first 2 decades of communism. Then, if you look at disadvantaged groups, so far we have this 20 most common surnames. So here we are talking about negative advantage, right? So we're talking about disadvantage. That's why this group level component is negative. So there were disadvantage in the beginning of communism. Now they're much less advantaged. So they converge to society, which is basically the value of 0. And actually, this is quite a fast progression, which implies the correlation of 0.45, which means that actually the social mobility for this group was quite rapid. There's very similar pictures if you look at those most underrepresented surnames in the interwar period. Here, although they were kind of less mobile as the previous group, the correlation point basically 0.67. And finally, which I think is super interesting, are those Romani surnames, which again, these are negative values here. So the Romani minority at the beginning of communism was disadvantaged and heavily disadvantaged. Now they're much more disadvantaged than they used to be, right? So you see that this group is diverging from the social mean. And actually, if anything, actually here I think it's so interesting that you see that they lost a lot of status during the communism. Actually, after the capitalism, you see some kind of stabilization of this mobility patterns. But I think it's striking to compare Romanis with other disadvantaged groups, where we see this convergence happening. And also, when you look at advantage groups, mobility, we see that they're also losing status; they're converging to the mean. But with Romani surnames in Hungary, we see that they're actually like the other way around. Okay, so some robustness checks.
Can I have a question?
Yeah.
If you show the graphs, can you show one of the graphs? Why did you choose 1985 and 1995 and not, for example, 1990? Because I mean,
this is just I should have changed this. This is just we are looking at the decadal averages. So this point means that this is the data when we aggregate data from between 1950 and 1959. So 1985 means that this is the aggregate.
Okay. Now I can understand. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I should change it. Sorry, I should have like the intervals here.
Yeah.
That's a good point actually. Yeah, I forgot to do that. I can also show the yearly data, but it is much less. I think this is a better picture. Now, some robustness checks. We also look at different definition of elite occupation. So here we have yearbooks of all the PhD graduates from the Budapest University of Technology and Economics, which is basically Hungary's largest polytechnics. And they basically produce a lot of engineers every year. So we have names and surnames of all the people who got PhD from this university. Unfortunately, we only have data from the 1960s until 2000. And so if we look at this definition of elite occupation, of course, here we have a smaller time window. So we start in the 60s, we finish in the 1990s. We see the same pattern. So we look at noble surnames. We see higher status at the beginning of the communism. Decline the status, the implied correlation is around 0.9. When we look at those who are overrepresented among high school graduates in the interwar period, we see basically no change in their status. I mean, I know it's just like 2 data points, so it's kind of hard to grow a strong picture, but we don't find evidence that actually they converge to the social mean. It's almost 1 beta. When it comes to most common surnames, we see some convergence, albeit with a smaller pace than when it comes to doctors. The same with those underrepresented surnames in the interwar period. Here we actually see that there is some kind of substantial change after the transition. So here you actually still have some evidence that if anything, actually, social mobility improved after transition to capitalism. And then we have again this striking picture that if you look at Romani surnames, we don't see any convergence at all. This group actually is losing its status. And again, it loses its status the most during the communist period. Now, other concern you may have is actually this Romani group. So as I said, this is a group which is which had a very low status. It's losing its status, but actually it's a group which have very quick, very fast population growth. So when you think about, let's say, this picture, so when you see about these two other disadvantaged groups gaining status, it's to be not that they actually gaining some advantage in the recruitment to medical schools, or they actually, climbing the ladder. It's just there's another group, Romani, which are just like much worse than them in terms of social status, and they are kind of like increasing in size. So maybe it's not like they're climbing; they're being pushed up by this Romani minority. So to kind of see what is actually driving the result. So here we kind of repeat the entire analysis, but here as a reference group, we don't take the entire population, but only non-Romani population. So basically what we do, we exclude Romanis from the entire analysis. And what we get is just kind of combine all these estimates. Again, these are the decades, these are the estimates of the advantage status. Here we have the Y-ending surnames. Here we have the high school overrepresented surnames. Here we have the advantage groups, the top 20 most common. And here we have the underrepresented surnames from the interwar period. And for the advantage groups, we see kind of a similar pattern, like gradual decline of the status, of some convergence towards the population, which is here, which is the line of 0. Now, when we look at disadvantaged groups, maybe not the best visible here, but you see some convergence, but it's much slower than when we kind of refer to the population of the reference point, which actually suggests that a big part of this, let's say, this figure, this convergence of the top 20 most common surnames, or the convergence of the underrepresented surnames, is because actually not because those people kind of climbed the ladder, it's because they were pushed up, but it's even the other social group, Romani, which were losing its status and they were growing in size. That's another interesting finding. And finally, we kind of play with different assumptions about this variance of the surname groups. Doesn't really matter that much. I'm going to keep it quickly because I don't have much time left. Yeah. So let me just quickly move to the final exercise, very simple one. We're actually trying to kind of look closer at this transformation from communism to capitalism. So here we get going back to medical doctors. And we're asking the question, so if you think about kind of how do institutions affect graduation from the medical schools, you may think that probably institutions matter at the selection to medical schools, right? So basically, communists maybe were active at, let's say, fighting nobility. So they said, okay, you cannot go to medical school because you are of noble origin, right? And that would mean that this group should lose, be relatively should lose its advantage when it comes to admission to medical schools. But here the question is whether the transformation has opened this medical profession. So kind of, maybe removed certain actions done by the communist government. So here what we do, we use the yearly data on relative representation of the privileged and underprivileged groups, and we kind of put them together. And then we kind of see whether any discontinuity in this relative representation around the end of communism and beginning of capitalism. Now the problem is, where do we find this cutoff point? Where do we find this year when we have capitalism? So 1989 is the last year of communism in Hungary. So all people who enter medical school in 1989 were still kind of governed by the kind of communist admission rules, let's say. Now, all people who enter medical school in 1990 were already kind of governed by the capitalistic admission rules. But of course, what we observe them 6 years later when they graduate from medical schools, in which case it's actually 1996. So we assume that 1996 is the first cohort of graduates, which was kind of admitted under capitalistic rules, and before, or the cohorts before of graduates were admitted under communism. So here, T, like the T equals 0 is basically the 1996. Here we have overrepresentation of relative representation, sorry, of the high status surnames, which are the nobility and those interwar period high status surnames. And we see that actually there is this downward trend. This is what was captured before by what was showing you before. However, we don't see much happening here around the cutoff. If anything, actually you see there's certain like little jump, but it's not statistically significant. If you look at the same thing, but for the disadvantaged groups, you see nothing at all. So it looks like, you know, we have a complete change of the system, but you don't see any change in admission to medical schools, for instance. So that's kind of one evidence that, you know, in some sense, this rapid, massive change of institution does not matter for social mobility because it may not really affect this admission rules. Okay, so let me conclude. So basically I'm going to repeat myself from the earlier slide. So the main findings, we find relatively low rates of social mobility. We don't find much difference in social mobility between communism and capitalism. We actually find that old gentry nobility were still very privileged during the communist time, although the system was directly aiming at reducing their status. Now we don't know why. So this is kind of would like to signal here. I don't know why it happened. What are the mechanisms? That's why we also don't have any particular policy implications at this stage. You can interpret it as you wish. You may go from one extreme to another one. So we're not kind of trying to, at this stage, to formulate any policy implications. And I think what's really worrisome here is the status of Romani minority, which is I think the situation of Roma people in Hungary is a big problem of this country. And I remember when I was doing my PhD, there were cases where members of the parliament would openly call them animals. In the parliament, it was the thing members of Jobbik. It was like 2011 or 12. So, and I think it's really worrisome to see that the status of this group has been declining through time instead of improving. Other interesting finding, which I didn't show you here, but it's in the kind of this bigger project. We actually show this kind of some positive message from this study is that actually you see that when you look at women, their disadvantage is decreasing through time. But this we can only show until like 1960s, unfortunately. But this was kind of if I would like show you the main project, that would be one of the positive sides, that actually you see that women are kind of losing its disadvantaged status. But unfortunately not other disadvantaged groups, in particular Romanis. So thank you so much. And